do here is go back.
So, all right. So, I mean, I don't look tense, but I definitely should mention that everyone is definitely more tense right now. The past 4 weeks, we've all been working from home and trying to overcome obstacles other than hot fixes, which is usually the only, the only issue we have to deal with. We're working under a little different and more stressful conditions, and that's not just us. That's all of you watching, all of you at home. It's definitely not an easy time. We're seeing essential workers, getting a lot of love and praise, which we are absolutely participating in. We're seeing people hopefully staying home and social isolating. But given the tension, there's really nowhere more true right now for us in our little world than with Warframe. And I think for Warframe in the community, the tension gets worse if we don't acknowledge it. And I want to make it as clear as possible that we have had some really serious conversations internally about the disappointing first impressions, namely with the last 3 sort of headliner updates, the Old Blood, Railjack, and then the Scarlet Spear, as recently as 2 weeks ago. So on top of that, you're kind of looking at the Nightwave intermission 2 and seeing that every day it's another day that this intermission has gone on for too long. And I just want to make it as clear as possible that there's never a version of the dev team that's trying to release bad or disappointing content. There's only versions of us recovering from when we do. And we really appreciate you guys sticking around. We know that the bad first impression situation we're in is not healthy for the community or us as developers. And the conversations we've been having internally, which, tend to be pretty candid right now about everything that's going on, are the ones I think the community would be wanting us to have about Warframe's future updates and the plans for this year. So I just wanted to make sure that any of the tension you guys are feeling is addressed and not just sort of a ambient feeling, because it's certainly one that we do need to take responsibly in terms of the quality and everything that we're working on. So I appreciate that some people may be feeling more tense than usual right now, and rest assured that we are too, and we are very aware, and we're not in a situation where we want to ignore such tensions. And hopefully next dev stream on April 17th, we can talk a little bit more about that. So thank you, everyone. That was just a semi-prepared version of trying to encapsulate in a way that I think addresses that sort of tension between the community and what's going on with the state of the 3 headliner updates. So yeah, hopefully my super zoom in awkward cropping has not casted an ill spell upon that spiel, but either way, I think it had to be said. So much love.
Yeah.
The next.
It says a lot when the community manager has to basically come out and say, we know that the last 3 updates pissed everyone off, but oh my fucking gosh, can somebody give Rebecca a medal? Don't get me wrong, I'm not a DE apologist by any stretch of the imagination, but even I'm aware of how much shit she's had to deal with and how much damage controlling she's had to do precisely because the last big 3 updates have been awful. You only have to look up how many people have made threads, videos and rants about Railjack, the Old Blood, and the Scarlet Spear patches to see how much people have hated them all. Under normal circumstances, I really think this game would have died with Railjack's release. I say normal because, honestly, I believe that without Rebecca on the community team, this game would be dead already. I might be petty towards DE, but even I have to admit, the amount of carrying that she has done over the course of the last year, in the face of the bulk of their own community being disinterested, angered, or just plain convinced to stop playing Warframe purely because of how broken and grindy both updates were on launch, is nothing short of astounding. I'm not trying to imply that DE's community team is perfect. Oh no, far from it. They have their own issues too. But compared to how much people hated Liches and Railjack because of how completely different they were from their announcement and TechnoCon reveal, it makes all the flaws of the community team almost negligible. I would honestly argue that the community-related side of DE has made minuscule steps to improvement over these last few years. For instance, the Warframe forums were heavily censored all the way back in 2014, to an almost comical extent, and they remain heavily censored today. For another instance, do you remember last year when I touched upon the chat moderation and guides of the Lotus programs respectively? Admittedly, DE did actually improve both of those programs, and Chiluric himself actually apologised for everything that he had done. But that didn't stop DE from dropping a passive-aggressive, "We're not doing this because you're angry right now, we're doing this because we've been talking internally about this for a while." Even though the players have been voicing their concerns over both programs over the past few years with no definitive action from DE. That is, until this little thing was made. I mean, seriously. Hop on Google or the Warframe subreddit and look up Warframe chat mod. You can see for yourself how far back that goes. For yet another instance, go back and look at when DE nerfed Excavation, because it was too rewarding too fast, according to DE Glenn's testing. When players question this approach, or why the other game modes couldn't be buffed or improved to be just as rewarding or not boring, this was the response. For one last instance, when the Old Blood update came out and everyone asked that DE tweak the Kuva Lich system because being instantly killed for having the wrong order of Parazon mods was the absolute opposite of fun and interesting, DE addressed this live on stream and basically responded with, "We're not changing this, we're doing other stuff right now. We might change it in a year."
All right, so for Liches, we have a lot of people that have the Old Blood update that think the flavor of them killing you versus you killing them is the antithesis of what Liches are. So we'll start the conversation on the framing of Liches. So you get your Parazon, you have your Requiems, you down your Lich, you go in for the stab, and the Requiem is wrong, and then you die. But the Lich also dies and goes away and gets stronger. Do we have any plans to change your consequence in that phase?
We don't have any plans for that, no? Yeah. No.
All right, so right now, yeah.
Surprise question.
Yeah, and
Surprise question.
I'm hip to eating shit. But let me talk about this other thing over here.
Well, it's live, so players
I
are
understand
talking
it's
about
live,
what's live,
but
of course. But I
at the
think
moment-
Yeah, I think the feedback I saw was why isn't it 76 days to kill a Lich?
yes, that was the
And-
TennoCon thing. that
And
we-
why, which is part of the TennoCon UI, and why can the Lich beat me up so badly?
Yes.
And of course, we didn't think that you'd want to wait 76 days to get a Lich weapon, Kuva Lich weapon. So we shortened that loop dramatically.
Yes.
And it did not work out, we thought, to have it going on and dragging on. And so we tightened that loop. And in terms of why does the Lich punch you out when you fail, one of the things we discovered when we did the finishers for the Liches was it was very interesting or unique for the game that there'd be someone that would kick your butt
Yeah.
for a change, because you kill everyone.
Yes.
And so that's why we did that inversion. So there you go.
That's not to say that there isn't changes to the system coming.
Yep.
Yep.
It's just right now that is not our focus. Obviously, with the giant pile of stuff that we just showed,
Yeah.
that's our current focus.
Yes.
Probably when we regroup in the new year, it'll be addressing those things.
And I think one thing that's been pretty popular around the office
And
is
more
just
factions, yeah.
yeah,
I was just going to say
more faction.
the system's going to always it's going to be looked at for a while because of the faction expansion.
And I mean,
as
if we
well,
make the
so-
Corpus Liches, maybe we'll make them last 79 days,
Yeah,
and then
absolutely, yeah.
people can have their cake and eat it too. You're 70.
That's not how things should be. I've said it before, and I'll keep saying it until it gets across to DE. The reason why people were so upset over this, the reason why people don't care about Warframe as much as they used to, and the reason why the us versus them mentality has been in place for years now, is because DE is refusing to listen to their players. The players are supposed to be an integral part of DE's games as a service philosophy. So why is it that when the community asks for universal vacuum over literally years on end, DE does absolutely nothing? But when one random person on Twitter complains about universal medallions, DE changes them within the next hotfix. This is a level of cherry-picking player feedback that makes virtually no sense. And it completely conflicts with the DE we all knew years ago.
When we expanded our customization, that was a huge part of what made people like the game better, just at a visual level. When we redid the melee system and the parkour system, those overhauls were particularly well received.
The movement in Warframe was originally pretty similar to most other third-person action games, running, jumping, and sliding. But a movement exploit known in the community as Zoran coptering allowed players to catapult their frames great distances. It fundamentally changed the way the game was played, but instead of nerfing this exploit, the team saw that the community was trying to tell them something.
You know, bullet jumping was brought in a way to traverse the levels quicker because players really loved what they called coptering, which was the movement was tied to the slide of a weapon. So certain weapons were really good at this because they had a very quick transition time, so they would fling you across the level. And some of these guys got insanely good and could basically traverse some of the biggest tiles in the game in basically one swing. And I was like, well, it's kind of game breaking, but we love that they love the flow of that. So instead of just nerfing that and moving on and going, no, you can't do that, we kind of embraced it and brought it into the core gameplay, but in a more controllable way. And I think that's kind of been the philosophy, is like the community latches onto things for a certain reason. Instead of just smacking their hands saying, no, that's not my vision, it's like, how can we embrace that and how can we bring that into the game and not just remove it outright?
Nobody should have to stand on a soapbox and scream at DE whenever something needs to be addressed, because that just gives off the impression that DE only visibly does anything when enough people are mad at them. And that only reinforces the idea that DE responding to the community is nothing but knee-jerk reactions. Kind of like how they nerfed 2 Warframes because of a time-limited event. But I have to be fair. There are cases where DE actually takes player feedback into consideration when improving or making content. For example, DE listens to Triburos' feedback on buffing Grendel, and DE listened to my feedback on reworking Vauban, which was made more significant because DE were the ones who approached me, not the other way around. Cases like those happen so infrequently that even though DE is capable of doing things, such as the Warframe Revised update, which had some positive reception, but again, examples like these happen so infrequently that nowadays all the bad things DE does are remembered more often than the good things. That's not how people want this game to be treated, myself included. I guess what I'm trying to say here is, even though I recognise that currently the majority of the community's grievances with Warframe have been caused in some form by the management and design side of DE, I'm going to criticise them as a whole instead of as individual groups, because that could be misinterpreted by some people as personal attacks. But enough of that. Hello there. My name is Raytorius. And I imagine that the first impression some of you have gotten just from glimpsing this video is something along the lines of,
"Oh shit, here we go again."
And to be quite honest, I wouldn't really blame you. To be even more honest, it says a lot that just pointing out the shortcomings of the developers is enough to get them to essentially crucify you, because that serves as a major red flag for how out of touch a developer is with their own community. However, there are 2 things which I want to make abundantly clear. The first is that what I have to say pertains to Warframe overall, instead of just focusing heavily on one particular topic. The second, and the most important one, is that Warframe overall is not in a better spot than it was a year ago, despite having received one of the biggest updates ever announced. DE will never admit it directly, but they know that they're losing the interest of their player base, and they have been ever since everyone realised that the upcoming content they announced at TechnoCon 2018 and 2019 was practically false advertisement. Despite Railjack having launched last December as a surprise during the Game Awards, Warframe didn't experience a spike in players as it usually does when a big update comes out. If anything, there wasn't a spike until February of this year, when DE rolled out the changes to Kuva Liches that everyone had been wanting for months. It makes you wonder for a bit. Why is it that nobody is interested in Warframe despite one of the most hyped updates of all time having been released? Well, it's simple. The Railjack update was, for lack of a better term, broken. It's pretty obvious that DE pushed out the Railjack update because it was nearing the end of 2019, and they needed to push something out for the players. But the cost of hastily releasing a clearly unfinished update was exactly that. We received a clearly unfinished update. Fast forward today to the ongoing Nobody Likes the Scarlet Spear event, Guess I'll Go Play Animal Crossing mood that everyone's been in for a while now. And now DE's paying the price for last year being questionable. You might be sitting there asking, everyone is hating on Warframe now. What did DE do to cause this? What changed? Nothing. Nothing changed. That's the problem. I've been a content creator for 5 years and counting for this game, and I can tell you right now without a shadow of a doubt that this game is suffering because they have no competent management. That's not just me throwing out insults. Go ahead and look at DE's Glassdoor website and read through every single employee review. By far the most commonly stated gripe from former employees about working at DE is miscommunication or bad management. Given how the last 2 years of content in Warframe have basically just been one buggy and unfinished mess after another, it's alarming to be given practically confirmation from people who have worked there that DE fails at the internal level. Which brings me back to what I have to say. If DE can't even recognise that the way they jump from one idea to another almost haphazardly isn't a problem, then how the hell are they supposed to recognise the actual problems of their own game? That's where the community in the partner program comes into play, right? Ha! Let's be real. You already know the answer to that question. It's honestly a joke. To the point of absurdity, even. Let's be completely honest for a moment. The Warframe Partner Program is a joke. Sabucci did a good job touching on the subject, but I don't think people truly grasp how little the Partner Program actually matters. Sure, having what's basically a hotline to DE and getting free stuff on request is nice, but in reality, it really isn't. I joined the Partner Program when it was known as the Fan Channel Program all the way back in 2016, where my hope was that having a direct line to DE would allow me to have feedback, bugs and player suggestions be more easily submitted and seen. In theory, that's what it is. In practice, the Partner Program is just a title and a fancy badge on your profile. In other words, it's basically the exact same thing as being a founder. Otherwise, there honestly isn't much appeal in being a partner in the first place. As quite a few other partners will agree here, the biggest draw of being a Warframe partner is being able to get basically all the new content for free, with the exception of Prime Access, Prime Vault, and standard game unlocks like Railjack or the Operator. Everything is just there. Being able to request platinum codes and prime packs to give away is nice, but not many people really do this to begin with, so it's not exactly a main attraction to being a partner. The partner Discord also exists. It's just there, like the Conclave. Again, other players will agree here that the partner Discord is basically just the same handful of people talking, with the occasional visit from a DE person that isn't someone on the community team. Being able to send feedback and bug reports to DE is very hit or miss. Sometimes DE responds to a submission and either fixes something that a partner reports or acknowledges an idea that's been posted. But the remainder of the time, you'd be lucky to have your post even acknowledged by someone at DE. It's pretty normal to have your bug reports and feedback go basically unread by DE. And I can't tell you how many times I've submitted some Vauban-related bug that's gone unread and is still present in the game. You can quote me on this. There is absolutely nothing that separates a Warframe partner from a regular player, except that we have a fancy title, get free shit, and occasionally stream or make a video. Having a way to get in touch with DE right away is nice, but it's currently not the biggest positive about being a partner, and that's a problem. It's bad enough that DE ignores their design council until once in a blue moon, when they let them name something or come up with augment ideas. But otherwise, the Warframe Partner Program is honestly just a joke. And I really don't blame Sabucci, Xanagoth, and Better Name Pending for not wanting to be a part of it. It's not even a new problem anyway. Warframe has a problem with retaining content creators to begin with. because they either lose interest and move on to another game, or they just never come back to Warframe. The Warframe Partner Program would have some semblance of dignity if it could take itself seriously by actually enforcing the standards that not just partners, but players have to follow. Judging by my wording, you probably know who I'm talking about here.
Seriously, grats on the weight loss. Thank you, OZD. I appreciate that. I've been working out too. You have to understand, like, I have been busting my butt at the gym, like, a lot as well. 74%, not bad. Well thought out systems. I remember when I'm into potatoes. Are you gonna bitch about something stupid? Let's hear about the stupidity, and I'm gonna fucking go in. Okay? We're gonna go in because some people are fucking idiots. Let's roll up these sleeves. Let's go in. Well thought out systems. I'm sorry, but there are many amazing well thought out systems. We can just take a look at Saren's rework to begin with. So maybe you don't actually understand mechanics. Maybe you had to take a look at things like Destiny 2 that actually upped its ultimates timers to go ahead and compare with what Warframe does. Sorry, but Destiny went to crap because it wasn't Warframe. Let's move the fuck along. Alright, let's go ahead and take a look at Paragon. Oh yes, Paragon, the game that's also gone now. You know why? Because they actually upped the timers on their abilities as well, because Warframe has some awesome thought out systems. One of the biggest systems in Warframe that is well thought out is the power system itself. The mod system is fucking fantastic too, because you get to change everything in Warframe. So let's take a look at this dumbassery over here. When I was a mission in Hello Hotfix and it's wave 31 and it's 2 minutes to restart, dumbass bitch. You dumbass bitch. You don't actually have to fucking leave for a hotfix. Bitch, are you stupid? Sounds like you're stupid to me, because you can actually stay in that mission. You don't have to leave the mission just because a hotfix comes in. Sounds like you're new here. You might want to fucking learn. I always end up losing all of my progress. No bugs because you don't really explore the game. Bitch, you want to see no bugs because I don't explore the game? You fucking dumbass piece of shit. Let's take a look right here. Take a look at these stats. What are your stats in the game? Because I've got 5.34K hours in the game. No bugs. I didn't say no bugs. There were bugs. But bitch, far less bugs than many of the AAA titles that are currently out there right now. Listen, DE is the kind of group of people that want to work on their builds. You know why? Why? You dumb piece of shit. And we need to talk about some other things. What about hotfixes? They occur so often in other games. They hotfix because they want to please us. They hotfix because they want to make sure that we're having a good experience in game. If somebody doesn't like the way that Saren works, we have the ability to give feedback, and guess what? They take that feedback and they put it into account, and guess what fucking happens? They hotfix it so that we're happy with what the fuck is going on in the game. But maybe you don't care about players' happinesses. Maybe you'd rather they just leave Saren the way she is and fucking walk away from her even if people have fucking issues. Okay? I'm not even done yet, you dumbass piece of shit. What games say in beta still tons of prime accesses? Dumb fuck. You know why it says beta? Because you can't update as often as Warframe does on Steam without having a beta title. So you're talking out of your ass like the dumb piece of shit you are. Sit the fuck down. Be humble. I play since Excal Prime. I've been everywhere and done everything. Bitch, please. Don't tell me about DE care. Bitch, please. Sit the fuck down, because guess what? Give me your in-game name. I'm into potatoes. Give me your in-game name. Give me your in-game name. Let's take a look at your profile. Let's take a look at your profile, honey. Give me your in-game name. Let's take a look at your profile, because I'm gonna tell you right now, you're not the only one with a fucking Excalibur Prime. You're not the only one in your Excalibur Prime. Sorry. So you can sit down and be humble. Because you ain't special. And you bitching about a whole lot of nothing. You're bitching about a whole lot of fucking nothing. Anyway, Let's get back into having fun with the game until this, and I'm gonna tell you right now, Steve, until this motherfucker gives us his IGN, delete his messages. I don't want to see a goddamn single fucking message until he gives us his IGN. Thank you, Diversion. Welcome, welcome, welcome. You're not very reasonable? I'm very reasonable. You're not very reasonable. Okay? I'm sorry. Then send it to me in game. Send it to me in game and I won't fucking say shit. I will block it out so nobody sees it. But you know what's not very reasonable? Saying that DE doesn't have well thought out systems. I'm sorry, but we have amazingly well thought out systems. Better fucking systems than you could come up with. Again, don't fucking speak until I get your IGN in game, cause I ain't playing around with none of this. I don't play like a little bitch, okay? I don't play like a little fucking bitch. And I'm gonna let you know right now. Ain't nobody here my fanboys. This is the fam. This is New Russia. We don't play here in New Russia. Okay? So you hush your mouth. Sit down and be humble. Let's move along. All right. Well, actually, you know what? It's 4 and the dev stream is starting right now. So I'm gonna let you guys go, right? I'm gonna let you guys go. I want to give Diversion a big hug out there. If you want a glyph code, please go ahead and message me. Let me know what platform you're on so I can go ahead and get that to you. What do you call this? I'm Ukrainian and New Russia offends you. You know what else also offends me? You know what else also offends me? You do! I'm gonna end the stream like that. I think that that's perfect. So I don't give a fuck where you're from. This is New Russia. I am Mother Russia. And I'm gonna send y'all off to go and watch.
The next day.
Okay. So, just so you're aware, I cussed someone out on stream yesterday pretty fucking badly. I had to put them in their place because they were acting a hot mess. We're gonna be real. They ended up getting banned because they were turd burglars. And the thing about it is, it's nice because people understand. It's easy. I know it led to a banning, but I could have that conversation explaining to them why they were wrong. Now, if they continue to be dumbasses, then they continue to be dumbasses. But many times, and let's be real, Rob doesn't have the greatest, what do you call this? Reputation in the Warframe community, right?
Hey, look at that! Look at that! No shit!
For what has been years now, Rob has demonstrated toxic behaviour, all of which has gone unaddressed by DE for years on end.
Like, I love the terminology. I love the terminology when people say, oh, you're so privileged. Oh, you're elitist. Bitch, you know why I'm elitist? You know why I'm elitist? Because I worked for it. Because I put the time in to get the reward. Now I have the reward and I expect you to put the same time in to get the reward. The same reward, you want the same reward that I get? You put in the same work that I put in. It ain't elitist, it's fair. It's only elitist because you're a little bitch. Because look at the Hunter Sigil, right? How much has that really changed? When was the last major change we got to the Hunter Sigil? Oh yeah, oh yeah. It's been ages. It's been ages, right? You know why we don't get changes to the Hunter Sigil? Because DE doesn't want new players to think that vets are better than them. We are, though. Oh, White Fang, you don't know about the Hunter Sigil? Every time that there is a tactical alert, there is a sigil. And the little graphic inside of the sigil is supposed to change depending on how many of the things that they did. Oh, is it Stratos? Oh no, oh yeah, Stratos Emblem, sorry, Stratos Emblem. Sorry, I don't know why I was calling it Hunter Sigil. So, we're looking at it, and I'm like, I've done many a tactical alert,
But this hasn't changed. Why is it capped out? Why isn't it still evolving? You said that it would be a way to show off our dedication to the game. So why isn't it updating? Oh, you capped it out because you didn't want new players to think that, oh, he's cooler than me. Fuck off. Oh no, Dory Richard, what happened? Oh, it's because you used the name. You're not supposed to use the name, babies. You do not speak the name. And I'll take care of that. Boom. Let's see. You skipped my question. Listen, I don't get to questions in order, mainly because my eyes jump all over the place. Is Plague Star on console? No, it's not. It's not on console quite yet. What do you call this? What happened to you? He's just an idiot. He's just an idiot that in general does not know what he's talking about. And it's like time and time again he proves that to be a true statement. Of course, like GA Bulletproof. And here's the thing, I'm gonna sound really arrogant. Yeah, of course I'm right. You know why? Because something is not gonna leave my mouth unless I know it's fucking right. That's why I come for people's necks on Twitter. Because I'm not gonna sit there and fight over something that I know I'm not right about. It's not like I sat here and I'm just like, oh, let me come up with an idea just to attack people and just to be mean on the internet. I'm not a mean person like that. But I use common sense and logic. And when people don't use common sense and logic, I get really fucking irritated.
Almost as if they're afraid just to mention him. This doesn't make much sense, because according to Rob himself, they get along rather well since DE knows him personally.
And as you guys know, I'm not super happy with Warframe right now, not in the least bit. And not only that, but I'm also not happy with the people internally at Warframe. So every single time I'm like mouthing off about Warframe, I feel like I'm Robin in that trailer saying, "Fuck Batman." That's the thing, like, DE knows who I am. Like, and when I say knows who I am, is in like, they know who I am, and they know me, they've known me personally for years. This is my third time being invited to TennoCon. Like, we have interactions. I DM Rebecca, I DM Pablo, like, we talk, right? There's things in the Saren rework that I had conversations with Pablo about. Like, you have to understand that I've been playing Warframe for 4+ years. I've been a content creator for Warframe for 4+ years. And they know that I'm not just what some people in the community think of me, you know? They know that I'm not a terrible person. But, you know, it's nice to not, you know, see hate messages about myself everywhere every now and then. I get that it's gonna happen. And I get that there are some unfounded reasons that it happens. But I ain't trying to play the homosexual card. But you know,
3 days later.
Let's see, remembering that you need, okay. Skim through Warframe Reddit and some of the people hate the ever-living shit out of you. I see some fucked up pins on your name being thrown about. Why the hate? Usually, they want an excuse for their homophobia.
This brings up a lot of the same questions and concerns that were raised from my video about DE's chat moderators. Namely, why is it acceptable for several reported cases of toxicity and misconduct to go unanswered or unpunished by DE? DE claims that they are not liable for the behaviour or content of partners, but that then brings up another question. If DE really has a hands-off approach when it comes to whatever their partners say and do, then why is it that DE staff members publicly shamed me on Twitter and passively-aggressively threatened to remove my partnership in response to my video on their chat moderators? This question becomes even more concerning when you consider that, like I've stated before, DE has only ever interacted with me once before my chat moderator video ever existed. Keep in mind, I've uploaded plenty of videos where I've either bashed DE or some aspect of the game that they have made. Despite that, do you know how many times DE has directly responded to me? Once. That was when I uploaded my Failures of Warframe video on the Guides of the Lotus. For the record, this is not a case of DE not being aware of Rob's years of misconduct. He has been talked about and reported enough times that the entirety of DE would have to be willingly ignoring all of it in order to not do or know anything. I myself explicitly asked and informed DE of the proper way to report a Warframe partner.
Hello Taylor, I apologize for the random question, but if I had evidence of a Warframe partner insulting his viewers, another Warframe partner, and as a whole while streaming, how would I go about reporting it?
Email is the best way.
I assume you will want me to email you?
It is the best for recording keeping, if you don't mind.
Understood. I apologize in advance if a large amount of clips are present, as I'm trimming down clips from hour-long streams and such.
The more info you have, the better. Thank you.
Not a problem. I have sent the email to the provided address. I sincerely apologize if for whatever reason it was sent multiple times, as I had trouble getting Google Drives to work. Also, you might want to make yourself some tea or coffee before looking at it, because although I have provided as much relevant evidence as possible, you'll be sitting down for quite a while.
Received. Thank you. We'll take some time to review what you have sent us.
And I never got a response after submitting it. This is simply a case of the developers refusing to do anything. Those who are outside of Rob's audience have an overwhelmingly negative perception and opinion of him. So much so that just mentioning his name in some areas is enough to anger some people. This is not a case of people just hating Rob for the sake of hating him either. Because there are indeed people who used to be fans that no longer watch him, simply because his behaviour was too much. Just in case you're wondering, this isn't a case of Rob putting up a personality and simply pretending to be a mean person, as Rob himself has stated that everything he says and does is 100% genuine. Now here's the thing. Because Rob's channel predominantly displays that he's gay, whenever any type of criticism is made against him, it's immediately claimed to be homophobia. That doesn't mean that homophobia doesn't exist, because it does. Those of you who remember RevXDev will know that although there was one point where he was on good terms with DE, he was still proof that homophobia does exist within Warframe. It's just not nearly as commonplace as Rob claims it is. However, dismissing all opposing opinions as discrimination is ridiculous to say the least, especially when you consider that there have been and are other LGBT Warframe content creators who are vastly more respected than Rob, such as Sabuchi and the Fate KO, simply because they don't blindly accuse their audience of homophobia. Besides toxic behaviour, the community has a negative opinion of Rob overall because he has a habit of claiming that something he dislikes was done under the guise of homophobia, and then accepting it as fact despite inventing it himself. Case in point, last October, Rob blocked and accused me on Twitter of being homophobic because of the chat moderator video that I uploaded, despite the fact that the video was live on YouTube for almost 9 months already. And Rob only decided to accuse me of being homophobic because he was tagged in a tweet directed at me for an unrelated topic. This is not even taking into account that Rob's Twitter account is essentially a political minefield. To put it very bluntly, Rob can be summarized to this.
That's disgusting. Oh, I see. So you don't want to see a close-up picture of my anus because you hate gay men.
No, I don't want to look at a close-up picture of anyone's anus.
Homophobe. Homophobe. There's a homophobe right here. Homophobe alert. Homophobe. Woo, 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 woo.
Hey. Hey, baby. Ready to go to lunch? Yeah. Latrell, this is Gavin. Gavin, this is Latrell. This is my boyfriend. How you doing?
I'm doing very well. How are you doing, Gavin? Gavin?
Great. Want to go?
Yeah.
Nice to meet you.
No, trust me, it's not.
It's not?
That's the guy. Oh, I get it. I'm not persecuted. I'm just an ass.
Misbehavior is one thing, but having a "you're wrong unless you agree with me" mentality is not a healthy thing, especially for people like the Warframe partners, who are essentially Warframe's publicity and advertisement group on YouTube and Twitch. But I digress. Why do you not make use of the vast number of partners you have for feedback? Do you have any idea how many players you could reach by simply allowing your partners to gather up feedback from their own communities over a certain topic, such as the new player experience or Railjack, gathering each partner's community feedback, looking for commonalities across every person's feedback, and then make adjustments to your developing content based on that? Do you have any idea how many player responses you could get by simply sending a message to every player's inbox in-game, and simply ask them directly for their thoughts instead of putting out a poll on a third-party website? Do you have any idea how excited players would be if their favourite content creator flat out said, "DE wants to know what your thoughts are"? You have a community at your disposal for ideas and suggestions, and you're not using it to its fullest potential. If anything, DE started listening to their community less and less compared to previous years, as Kuva Liches will indicate. The majority of the community disliked how Liches could simply one-shot you for having the wrong Parazon mod sequence. And DE's response was simply, "We're not changing it, maybe we will next year." Although listening to player feedback is, for the most part, a good thing, the way that DE cherry-picks player feedback is so incredibly ridiculous that it calls into question why the partner program even exists, besides just to be a free advertising program for DE. Exhibit A. DE intended to release universal medallions as a way for players to be able to rank up any syndicate of their choosing, but at a slower pace since universal medallions have a low drop rate.
Anything, universal medallions would have been a bigger grind than Conclave itself, because you would literally need 372 universal medallions to get to max standing, which sounds simple, until you remember that each medallion has a 5% drop rate. This would have been a completely insane but reasonable grind for players not interested in spending hours looking for a Conclave match to take, but this got shot down because Conclave is apparently better off being more abandoned than Evolve.
The majority of players saw this kind of grind as a good thing, because this would have indirectly tied PvP content with PvE content, and although it would be a mountain of grind, obtaining universal medallions would allow players to rank up the Conclave without having to spend hours just looking for a match, because as we all know, nobody cares about Conclave because Warframe is not a PvP-centric game, meaning that quite literally the entirety of the Conclave can be safely ignored. However, what ended up happening instead was some random Conclave player on Twitter complains about how it nullified the grind that Conclave players endured, which caught the attention of DE, who ended up removing that feature of universal medallions. And because of only one person, what could have been a way for players to get involved somewhat with the Conclave has been trashed altogether, and the Conclave remains ignored by the majority of the community. Again, because of only one person. You can argue that DE made this change because they didn't want to upset the players that grinded Conclave, but that argument gets thrown out the window when you remember that DE refunded everyone who grinded Railjack precisely because it was a grind fest to begin with. Exhibit B. Universal Vacuum, obviously. For what has been essentially years, the players requested that DE implement Universal Vacuum on the basis that Carrier was the only companion that anyone cared about, because it made picking up loot significantly easier. And that's how it was until Carrier Prime came out, which was literally the exact same thing but with better stats. The reason for refusing to implement Universal Vacuum was never given, and the subject was never touched again until DE introduced the Fetch mod for companions in 2018. It's kind of laughable that implementing Universal Vacuum was a no-go for DE, but implementing a mod that disables Vacuum on Titania's Razorwing because a very small percentage of people demanded it isn't a problem. There's nothing wrong with listening to the community and making a mod just for them, because again, it's just a mod, rather than a change for the entire game, like the nerf to Universal Medallions. However, if DE has no issue with making mods in response to the community, then why haven't they made a mod that allows players to lock in a specific buff for Mirage's Eclipse, instead of having to rely on the lightning of the environment? Why haven't they made a mod that disables or replaces Vauban's Vexipad with Concuss? I hate Band-Aid mods as much as the next guy, but I'd rather have a Band-Aid mod than have a change straight across the board like with Universal Medallions. Exhibit C. DE repeats mistakes. Regardless of however you feel about the developers, everyone knows that what DE promises and what we get instead are two completely different things. Remember when they added the Cybeer, and everyone was mad about how much grinding it took? DE said they would learn from that and never make anything that's grindy ever again, until they made the Hammer, which was worse because the crafting requirements for it change based on how big your clan is, and even worse because DE then stated they would not lower the crafting requirements because it would upset the people who grinded it, which is no longer a valid argument given that they had no problem giving out a Railjack resource refund not too long ago. Remember when people thought that Scarlet Spear would have massive arcane grinds like the Plains of Eidolon did on release, and DE claimed that they didn't want to squeeze the player base into grinding? And that's what ended up happening.
Now, these show on here as rank 5. And if you had to pay 1,000 Scarlet credits for a rank 5 of these, that would be the deal of a motherfucking lifetime. That would be the hotshot deal. That would be way too cheap to offer these for. Same for the 1,500 that the uncommons cost. But you don't get a rank 5 as this UI seems to say. You are getting a rank 1. So whenever you click in further, you see the unranked one that you are actually going to be getting. This just shows you the full effect of these whenever they're fully leveled up, which requires 21 of each of them. So this is 21,000 for a set, which means that that is, let's call it 4.5 hours of your time to get a full set of a common arcane. Now let me tell you what you could almost certainly do with those 4+ hours of your time to get these way easier. You could go farm prime parts and then sell those prime parts and just buy a full set and probably have some fucking platinum left over. Like, you could probably go farm prime parts for an hour, and then let's say it takes you an hour to sell them. Fuck it. And you would have enough to buy a full set of Arcane Nullifier very, very quickly because it is not expensive. I'll show the price on screen of an Arcane Nullifier at max rank. It is not hard to get that amount of platinum. And this is a good arcane. This is an arcane that is like a meta choice for Eidolons, so you can ignore all the magnetic effects. It's not like this is a nothing arcane that no one uses. This is a desirable arcane. So it's absurd to me that you could spend that insane amount of time just to get a common arcane. 1,000 credits a piece when we need 21 of them. Plus, that's only obviously, you're only going to obviously be getting these arcanes after you get like the weapons and stuff that are exclusive to this event. So you have to go through many, many hours of farming this, and then you're faced with like 4 hours for common arcanes and like, I'm gonna say like 6 to 7 for uncommons, and who knows how many hours for rares, and who knows how many hours for legendaries. Like, I know this event lasts a month, but that seems like real wild style amounts, and you'd just be better off selling prime parts and farming the platinum.
Remember when DE nerfed Elite Sanctuary Onslaught by killing the efficiency drain and the high focus gains, despite both the subreddits and forums not wanting the mode to be gutted? Remember when DE made changes to the chat moderator program after my video was uploaded, but then didn't do anything for the moderators on console misusing their chat kick powers? Remember when DE said they wouldn't make Railjack be another island of grind, and they didn't want it to be ruined by technical flaws, and then it came out as another island of grind with technical flaws? Of course you remember that. We all do.
What should we do with the Railjack update? What should we do with the Railjack update? What should we do with the Railjack update? Let's go on vacation. Screen shaking bug is making me seasick. Screen shaking bug is making me seasick. Screen shaking bug is making me seasick. Let's go on vacation. Frozen in slingshot and can't do nothing. Frozen in slingshot can't do nothing. Frozen in slingshot can't do nothing. Let's go on vacation. Turrets in the floor and we can't reach hold breach. Turrets in the floor and we can't reach hold breach. Turrets in the floor and we can't reach hold breach. Let's go on vacation. Stuck in the ship cause we're alpha testers. Stuck in the ship cause we're alpha testers. Stuck in the ship cause we're alpha testers. Let's go on vacation. Good enough for now, we'll patch it later. Good enough for now, we'll patch it later. Good enough for now, we'll patch it later. Let's go on vacation. Ford gets fixed, get it on each console. Ford gets fixed, get it on each console. Ford gets fixed, get it on each console. Let's go on vacation. Difficult aiming with sensor bars blocking. Difficult aiming with sensor bars blocking. Difficult aiming with sensor bars blocking. Let's go on vacation. This took 2 years and still busted, broken. Screech hollow hype from Tenocon boasting. All but proves that the gameplay was merely simulation. 200k to bribe folks to play it. 200k to bribe folks to play it. 200k to bribe folks to play it. Let's go on vacation. Using our queen but with on-foot weapons. Using railjack with our queen weapons. State of the game gives me depression. Let's go on vacation. Ribbon sell great at RNG weapons. Ribbon sell great at RNG weapons. Ribbon sell great at RNG weapons. Let's go on vacation. No loot at all if you forget to refine. No loot at all if you forget to refine. Room's on fire, but this is totes fine. Let's go on vacation. Just 2% of the player base seen it. Just 2% of the player base seen it. Just 2% of the player base seen it. Let's go on vacation. What should we do with the Railjack update? What should we do with the Railjack update? What should we do with the Railjack update? Let's go on vacation.
Honestly, at this point, just trying to open up any avenue of criticism against Warframe or its developers seems almost pointless given how frequently they seem to make a decision that gives off the impression that they don't play their own game. Let me remind you, there's a reason why they study to rework enemy armor scaling, status procs, and add shield gating to the game seemingly out of nowhere despite the fact that all three were heavily requested by the players for years. There's a reason why barely a month ago they put up job openings for player acquisition and retention positions on their company website. And yes, this is actually real. There's a reason why Warframe can be perfectly described in just 5 seconds.
No!
In case I have to spell it out for you, it's because the people who love this game aren't being listened to anymore. And to no one's surprise, less people are willing to play this game. Not even the content creators. And you want to know what's sad? We're in the middle of a global pandemic, and yet less people want to play. If that alone isn't a sign of how little people care about Warframe, then I don't know what is. The people who have been here for years, promoting and supporting the game despite all its flaws since then, are leaving. The people who once spoke nothing but praise for the game now refuse to touch it with a 10-foot pole. Do you want to know why? Because DE has learned virtually nothing from their community. I think that I speak for a decent amount of people when I say that the main draw of Warframe is the theme of Space Ninja action shooter. The first thing we saw in Warframe was this. And that's what captured our interest. Instead of focusing on action or the core experience of Warframe, Digital Extremes has done nothing more than throw in hamster wheel after hamster wheel that does absolutely nothing to contribute to the main concept of Space Ninja action shooter. You could quite literally ignore both of the open world zones in Warframe, and you wouldn't lose out on anything apart from Warframes, which you could just buy from the market anyway, and weapons. Now, here's a question I have to pose for you. What is the appeal of Warframe anymore? It's not for casuals, because the reworked new player experience is nowhere to be found. Not to mention that DE clearly needs help in bringing in and keeping players. It's not for the lore nerds, because the story has been ridiculously stagnant for the last 2 to 3 years, simply because of how slow DE is to release updates that impact the main plot of Warframe. It's not for the hardcore players, because even the players who normally don't mind grinding refuse to touch the game with the latest event. I wouldn't be surprised if they start referring to hotfixes as content in the future. Because just like how Fashion Frame is endgame, apparently a patch is enough to warrant a video, therefore it's basically content. Which begs the question, what is Warframe trying to be anymore? A game or a career? It's become plainly obvious over the past few years that Digital Extremes has a very big ambition for what they perceive Warframe to be. But the problem is that they're incapable of actually executing it. Warframe has unironically turned into No Man's Sky ever since Railjack came out. But the difference is that No Man's Sky started off being broken and eventually got improved, whereas Warframe started off broken and remains broken with each big update that DE decides to advertise. People seem to forget that DE is first and foremost a company, and that's the thing. They're a company. Every single time that DE lies to the player base, they get away with it because they're a small indie developer, or because they put out some cookie-cutter PR speech about learning from mistakes. You've likely seen reviews of Warframe, because apparently not enough of those exist already, or have at least heard something along the lines of Warframe is free to play done right. While all of that isn't exactly false information, it's not an accurate representation of the game overall, and that's problematic. Each of these media outlets that praise or heavily promotes Warframe as a hidden gem of a game do nothing but make DE complacent, and that's a problem that should never have happened in the first place. For instance, DE laughed off the prospect of Anthem being a competitor to Warframe on the grounds that it was released as a broken, shambling mess.
Right, you think about Warframes, you rename them Jav...
Stop!
Javelins.
Javelins, yeah, javelins.
Okay.
It's only been a year since then, and now DE is the one releasing broken, shambling content. Could they have done anything in the last year to prevent this? Of course they could have. DE just chose not to. Remember the Design Council? You know, the sub-forum that DE explicitly made for the sole purpose of having a pool of assorted players to draw feedback, ideas and general players' feedback from. It's been dead for years now. They just name Warframes and give augment ideas 2 or 3 times a year now. And if they're lucky, DE posts there once a month. Remember the community inbox? You know, the one-stop shop that a normal player like you and me could use to submit a question, comment or concern to DE. It still exists, it's just that there is nothing that even mentions it apart from the announcement post, and there hasn't been any attempt to make it more known to the community. Which, to be honest, makes me draw a similar parallel to a particular program that DE made and ignored for years. Remember the partner program? You know, the thing that DE made specifically to support their content creators by allowing them to have a direct line to DE employees for feedback, bug reporting and support. Yeah, most of the partners currently equate making Warframe content to being about as fun as paying your taxes. Dear Digital Extremes, you are inadvertently running your game into the ground. For whatever reason, despite the fact your game grew and thrived on the idea that you interacted and conversed with your player base like the tight-knit community it's supposed to be, and despite the fact that you yourself state that your philosophy is to embrace the player rather than punish them when it comes to unintended things like cornering, you abandoned that. Under this philosophy, you found yourself gathering a large and incredibly devoted community simply because you refuse to do what every other free-to-play developer eventually does, and that's killing the game by disregarding the community. Caring about the community is not a difficult concept to grasp. Literally any intern is capable of scrolling through the forums and subreddits to look for whatever player's feedback is most repeated and discussed. You should know this already. Rebecca herself used to be an intern, and now she's practically carrying the entire community team. Killing off a game is not something that most people don't strive for, but your insistence on doing things your way without regard to the players makes it come across like you're trying to see how far you can push your own player base. We all remember how Steve wanted to have liches be able to one-shot players as an interesting and fun mechanic, and it only got changed after the overwhelming backlash from the players. Whatever happened to our actions will speak louder than words, as you told me last year. I recognise that I'm in a very fortunate position when it comes to being a content creator. Unlike other partners, I don't rely on Patreon, or God forbid, YouTube revenue to keep my channel running. I might be a Warframe channel, but I do not need Warframe to put food on my table or to pay my bills. And that alone opens up a wider degree of freedom for me when it comes to expressing how I feel about the game. And in case you're unaware, I take full advantage of my ability to criticise Warframe and DE. Even though a decent amount of people have been leaving Warframe over the course of the past year or so, because the game has figuratively been on a downward slide since the Old Blood was released, I remain here making Warframe content despite not having anything to gain from doing so. I've stated in the past that I firmly believe in the potential of this game, and as someone who has quit and come back to Warframe, I know what it's like to be frustrated with the game. Everyone's been there. However, I am of the opinion that despite its many current flaws, what Warframe needs right now is not new content. It's not revisits to old content, and it's not announcing content. What Warframe needs is for DE to take a step back, reflect, and pull themselves together. All of us might joke about how Warframe is in eternal beta, but the reality is that Warframe was, is, and always will be an ever-evolving video game, led on by the virtually bottomless ambition that has allowed DE to make this in the first place. However, by pursuing a desire to always be trying to constantly expand and outperform itself, Warframe has lost its way. The game that once drew in players such as myself for its Space Ninja action theme has become a Space Ninja action game with miscellaneous pieces of content that have little to do with the main concept of be a looty-shooty ninja in space. What made Warframe an absolute blast to play years ago has become abandoned for the sake of having newer and bigger expansions. But this has led to a system where DE keeps promising their players the moon, over and over and over and over. I don't think I'm alone in saying, we don't want cosmetics to be considered content for the game. We don't want the game to sacrifice quality and ship out updates that are buggy, broken, or both. We don't want new updates to try to one-up the previous updates. As a player and content creator, I appreciate and share in the passion that you have for Warframe as developers. But the fact of the matter is that your endless ambition is starting to be your biggest flaw. I would love to be as invested in the gameplay and story as everyone else was when the second Dream came out, but the past 2 years of content have made Warframe less about Warframe and more about trying to impress and keep as many people as possible. In case you've forgotten already, Warframe has built up its reputation as free-to-play done right over the past 7 years precisely because it was Warframe. You were with the players right from day one. You listened, played, and over the course of time, crafted the game into a shared vision of what you and your community wanted. Your biggest draw 7 years ago was the potential your game had.
At the moment, I don't feel it's really got enough content to keep people playing for all that long, because no matter how you slice it, it's a third-person action game whereby you can have 2 weapons and a melee weapon, and you beat people up, and occasionally you do these little hacking mini-games, and you get your way through the objectives, and there's only so much you can really do with that, right? There is a storyline to it. It's pretty much threadbare. It sets up the principle behind the game prior to starting. When you play the tutorial, it says, oh, you know, you've been reawakened, blah, blah, blah. These humans are all over the place. You're supposed to kill them. They're a corrupt empire, and so on and so forth. And that's pretty much where it goes. And even with the addition of the crafting system in there, which is fairly basic kind of production line stuff with the components, I think mine... seems like my components have disappeared for whatever reason. Beta is beta. I'm just a little bit concerned about its longevity. But again, as I should very, very much emphasize, this is in beta. So it doesn't necessarily mean that there won't be a ton of content and different ways to play added. It's currently closed beta, so this is just indicative of what the basic framework of the game actually is. And the basic framework is solid. There are some elements of it that really stand out as being great. I mean, aesthetically, it's awesome. It's got great graphics. It feels really, really smooth. It runs really, really well. It's relatively bug-free for a beta. And the combat is It's kind of run-of-the-mill with some small sparks of brilliance, but not that many of them. If I were to compare it to, say, Mass Effect 3's multiplayer, I'd maybe put them on par, saying that Mass Effect possibly wins out just in the sense of how the guns feel and how the combat just feels meatier and heavier and has a lot more weight behind it. You don't really get a huge amount of that here, with the exception of the melee weapons. Using a sword or using the gauntlets to pound people into pieces is really, really fun. The enemies, for the most part, act in a pretty smart way, and they can be quite challenging, as you've seen in this video. So I think there's a lot of potential here. There really, really is. But I'm not really sure where they want to go with it and what they're going to have to add to it, because we've seen games like this before, probably the most obvious one being Global Agenda, and it running into a situation where even with extensive PvP options, running the PvE stuff just became a little bit tedious after a while because it was very, very repetitive. And the reason that single-player games get away with this is because they have a full storyline, cutscenes, and they're constantly moving through different territory. Here, as you can see, I've spent, a good few hours in essentially the exact same rooms because all of the levels in Mercury are identical in terms of their tile set and the actual theme behind it. So, certainly potential involved in Warframe, definitely. It's a very high fidelity, obviously kind of AAA quality, free-to-play game. But it, I think, has a long way to go before it can really define itself as absolutely top tier and really have the content that's going to keep people playing for longer than a couple of days. All right, folks, there you go. A look at the closed beta of Warframe, and I'll see you next time.
It's been 7 years since then, and you're dangerously close to completely throwing out your potential in exchange for a game design not for old and new players to have fun, but to keep players slogging through unfinished content over and over, almost like a hamster wheel. As someone who's a Firefall veteran, I'm seeing a lot of similarities between why it's died and the current state of Warframe, namely, mismanagement, players outright leaving, and the developers having a constant need to reinvent the wheel, so to speak. You have potential. You have a community. Please don't piss it all away because you stopped caring about what's made your game so appealing to begin with. Yours sincerely, Raytorius. Thank you for watching.
Dig my hole, you build a wall. I dig my hole, you build a wall. One day that wall is gonna fall. Gonna build that city